Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it is time once again for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I quickly review some stuff I missed. Not necessarily all the stuff I missed, but some of it. So I got 17 projects from 2019 and 3 from other years that I didn't feel like making a proper video on. Covered gauntlet style a la Fantano's Why You Know review, Spectrum Pulse Trailing Edge, etc. Not exactly a video I was exactly looking forward to doing, but, you know, it was one I felt like I just needed to do. There's also 2 more releases from last year that I missed that I wanted to make a proper video on. I didn't know Kenny She put out a new album last November, so that guy deserves a more dedicated video with an in-brief segment. And I'd also seen a lot of recommendations for Tipper's Jettison Mind Hatch. Was planning on putting that in this video, but he's also got quite a substantial back catalog that I'll need to get through first. Looked like there was enough discussion material for a proper video there too, so hopefully you'll see those in the near future, but whatever. I'm gonna be trying to keep these segments fairly brief because there are 20 releases here, but I also got 18-page Google Doc in front of me, so yeah, we got a lot of stuff to cover. Let's get into it. Starting off with Blanck Mass, Animated Violence Mild. Right, starting off with a project that I saw a bunch of other people reviewing and I planned on properly covering myself, but it just kind of fell through the cracks. I did review this guy's previous album, World Eater, and I quite enjoyed it all the way through at the time, though it didn't really stick with me in the long term. I haven't listened to it a single time since that video dropped. But whatever, this new project, it's certainly something. For the most part, this project is a collection of unrelenting, balls-to-the-wall, blown-out, noisy bangers. Every sound is cranked up to 11, most of them are distorted and clipping the mix, all featuring intense and soaring melodic flares that give the album a more commercial feel than his last ones. When the track Death Drop first came on, I was hooked immediately. It sounded like some awesome theme to a final boss in a video game, and it had such a chaotic feel to it that came off pretty badass. Though, as the album went on, the sound is continually just as unrelenting the entire time. You're never given a chance to breathe throughout the rest of the project. Maybe a brief interlude in Creature/West Fuqua, or however you say that. The second half of that track is a more toned-down breather moment that is very much welcome, but that minute-and-a-half section is about all you get. Everything else is just firing on all cylinders the whole time, and I'll be blunt, it got to be too much, personally. I mean, the melodies are all good, the mix is pretty epic, but to be honest, these instrumentals weren't as detailed as you might think. Or at least the intensity of the mix drowned out a lot of the details. It ended up feeling more shallow than it probably should have. The mix is so blown out all the way through that it even ends up headache-inducing. Worst examples of this happening are in Love is a Parasite and Wings of Hate. Especially the former. There's so much clipping in that one that made it harder to sign off on the admittedly compelling melodic moments in the middle section. This project isn't even that long, like 43 minutes or so, but it felt a lot longer than that, personally, because it was just so unrelenting. I mean, I get the feeling it's trying to be like that on purpose. Like, I feel like I heard somewhere that it was partially a critique on how living under capitalism and its constant flash and spectacle can be really tiring or something. Though being intentionally tiring doesn't make it more fun to listen to. And okay, I know it sounds like I hated this project at this point. I really didn't. It was fine. There's still lots of moments all over the place I did enjoy. Every track had some really good, epic, and over-the-top lead melodies that prevented me from disliking any of this. And the track No Dice was slightly more toned down than everything else, which did give a chance for the weirder textures and rhythms to come through better. I still thought the whole thing was pretty cool. I can see why people would be more into it than me. It certainly bangs all the way through, but I personally find the project too overbearing and headache-inducing. And whether that feeling was crafted on purpose or not, either way, it's unlikely I'm gonna come back to it. Solid 6 out of 10. Next up, we got Pamcy with BINIBINI. This was thrown at me as a recommendation from Mark from Spectrum Pulse several months ago. It's just been sitting in my folder of stuff to review since August without me having touched it, and I kind of wish I'd bothered to pick this up earlier. I mean, I barely have anything to say about it, but I really enjoyed it. It's basically like a minimal deep house album from this obscure Bandcamp artist hailing from the Philippines. And right from the outset, with the first track Beauty Parlor, I heard her blend of these smooth but sharp synth progressions and thick groove-driving bass lines with these pretty prominent jazz influences. I heard plenty of horns and vibraphones in the mix. And the remaining 7 tracks showed variations on this blend, creating a fairly low-key but still danceable and energetic mix that was really nice and refreshing. Many tracks had little flutes and chiptune melodies and various vocal snippets in the background, and all of them had a lot of driving energy and personality, while still feeling pretty chill at the same time. The album's only 27 minutes, so it's over super quick, though not feeling like it got cut off too early. And, you know, I don't really have anything to say from an individual track basis. I suppose the track Buko Pandan, or however you say that, had a bit of a disorienting feel that didn't quite come together, and was probably the single weakest point on the album. And the whole thing did shrink a little bit with repeat listens, but still, if you like that last Mr. Fingers album from 2018, I think you really have to give this a shot. It's a really underrated project here. We have to keep an eye on her going forward. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, Daniel Lopatin with the Uncut Gems soundtrack. Oh hey, Oneohtrix Point Never made another film soundtrack. I haven't actually seen the movie. I've heard a lot of good things about it, though. Apparently it's the first good Adam Sandler-related thing to come out in a very long time. But I'll just give some really quick thoughts on the soundtrack, completely out of context, since some people were interested in hearing me talk about it, I guess because I already reviewed the soundtrack to Good Time. And basically you can just copy-paste pretty much all my thoughts on that soundtrack to this one. They're pretty similar. I guess the Good Time soundtrack is a tighter and better constructed as an out-of-context album experience. This has a lot more tracks that are like 2 minutes or less, but this one also shows Lopatin working with choir, a little bit of orchestra too, a lot of woodwinds, especially in the opening moments, a lot of flutes and clarinets and the like accompanying his usual blends of synths, a couple of sax solos, and other quick jazzy moments here and there. Things do get pretty Tangerine Dream-esque in parts too. But yeah, if you heard the Good Time soundtrack, the Uncut Gems soundtrack delivers something pretty similar with higher budget and more instrumental textures. It's about what you would expect. It's some good stuff. 7.5 out of 10, I think. Next up, Knife Party with Lost Souls EP. Right, Knife Party came back with their first EP in a long time last year too. Since I reviewed all the others a while back, I figured I should give this a shot. And, yeah, it's not good. I mean, there's one pretty decent song on it. Death and Desire with Harrison is a pretty fun, if kinda bland, melodic pop EDM banger. The other tracks, mostly just kinda disappointing, honestly. No Saint is just a plain old big room house track with no strings attached. How fascinating. We really needed more of that in 2019. Ghost Train was almost really cool and unique with its intro that's kinda like this weird atonal atmospheric techno track and had all these cool train sound effects. But then the drop shows up and then it's just a big room house kicking some really annoying whistling noise, completely ruining any chance this track had at fulfilling that potential. And the title track, ugh, that one's just cringy and terrible all around. I mean, there's a section in the middle with all these layers of synth textures that wouldn't have been out of place on that Uncut Gem soundtrack I just finished talking about. That part was good. But the narration describing dubstep festival goers like weird animals who hit each other with their penises was fucking stupid and not funny. And the drop with all its pitched down club rapping in the background sucked too. Like, I know these guys always make, like, self-aware joke tracks, but this isn't self-aware, it's just bitter and resentful. Has me wondering why Rob Swire's still making music like this if he so obviously hates doing it. I don't get it. Just make the music you enjoy making, for fuck's sake. I mean, I suppose this EP isn't too far a cry from the stuff that got them big. It's not unlistenable or anything, but, like, these guys just sound tired and irrelevant on this thing. Rehashing old ideas that haven't aged well, sounding stuck in the past with none of the self-awareness they used to have, and not even enjoying themselves. And it's just kind of depressing to listen to more than anything. Obviously, again, if a fourth Pendulum album finally comes out, I'm still going to be on that on my earliest convenience. But this did pretty effectively kill off any excitement for new Knife Party material going forward. Yeah, this kind of sucked. Solid 4 out of 10. Next up, Mick Chillage with 0919. This isn't so much a proper album as it is a sampler. Michael Gainford is a heavily prolific artist who's put out dozens of albums over the years, and I'd been kinda interested in, thanks to his work with Lee Norris and Autumn of Communion, that I've been a fan of for a long time now. I decided I should give this project a shot too, not being too familiar with Mick Chillage's solo work, and feeling like this compilation of snippets from his previous material, organized into 3-hour-long mixes, would be worth my time. I obviously can't speak to how well it does his discography justice, whether it's meant to be a collection of snippets that showcase what he considers his best work, or what would be a good introduction to what he's capable of. I don't know. But this is obviously the only project from him I've listened to all the way through. Okay, I did sample through his album Intervals of Light a while back too, and I remember that being pretty cool and well produced, if not the kind of thing that really grabbed my attention or stuck in my head, enough for me to be able to identify a snippet from there in this project. But okay, 0919, listen to the whole thing, and yeah, I really liked it. It was pretty solid. I mean, it's not the most unique or out-of-the-box stuff I've ever heard. Gainford's style doesn't seem too far a cry from the kind of stuff you might hear in some, like, Pete Namlook or 2000's Ultimate Records projects. And again, I wouldn't say this is the kind of project that's really gonna stick with me in the long term or feel super memorable, but I did have fun listening to it, and came out of this 3-hour project feeling altogether pretty fulfilled. And that is an accomplishment I do have to give props to. He does show quite a bit of production talent and versatility here. Lots of ambient and beatless subspaces created here that range from spacey and expansive to warm and intimate. Some darker and creepier moments, some comforting piano-driven sections, etc. It's also almost entirely ambient, with only a few select sections that have some kind of defined pulse, let alone actual percussion. But that's all well and good, because he does change things up enough to prevent the mix from growing stale. There are lots of parts here that have me feeling like I'm floating out into the outer reaches of the galaxy. A lot of cool, immersive stuff. Now, obviously, 3 hours is a lot of time to budget. Not the kind of thing that everyone is gonna have the time for, and hell, I don't even recommend going through the whole thing in one sitting anyway. I tried it myself and kinda tapped out halfway into the third mix. Still impressive he had me invested that long. Also, this is not necessarily the kind of project that really merits paying super close attention the whole time. It's probably okay if you just have it on in the background, so long as you can just soak up the atmosphere. But if you do think you can set aside that time and are interested in a project like this, I do think it's worth giving a shot. I liked it. 7.3 out of 10. Next up, we got Renard with Best of Lapfox Volume 1, Because Maybe. So yeah, this is not from 2019 at all. A certain commenter has been asking me to cover any release from Halley Labs / Lapfox for ages now. Years maybe. And I was just curious enough to give her stuff a shot. I'm told this was re-released in 2019 at some point. Said commenter linked it to me and gave me a recommendation to check it out, so I dropped it onto this video because, hey, why not? It's a compilation of tracks that apparently came out way back in 2010, and I have had a couple of brushes with works of Emma Essex before. I'm told that all the artists attached to Lapfox are all just her aliases. The only Lapfox project I'd previously heard in its entirety was Wanderlust by the Quick Brown Fox, and I personally did not enjoy that album at all. I thought it was so ridiculously fast-paced and overly happy to the point of being unintentionally horrifying. Though I also, there were also some like old tracks that I believe he put out as Kitsune Squared, which were like some fads for YTPMVers back in the old days. Like Rainbow Tylenol and Rock Your Emotions and a few others I can't remember the names of but would easily recognize the tune to. Distinctly remember liking all those as a kid. And I believe she also collabed with a friend of mine, Vivian S, on her Kingdom of Colors mini-album, which I covered in the first Some Stuff I Missed. Oh yeah, and I think she also follows me on Twitter. That's a thing too. But yeah, that's as far as my experience with this artist goes. Figured I may as well give another project a fair shot. And, well, this project is not horrifying. Yeah, I don't think it's really my thing, either. I kind of felt the same way listening to this that I did to that Blanck Mass project I started this video with. It's just intentional sensory overload all the way through with not a second of breathing room. It's a breakcore release with pummeling hardstyle kick drums, ridiculous amen breaks, and other dense percussion, but there are always still present melodies, often from obvious on-the-nose samples. Like there's a track that samples some cover of Higher Love by Steve Winwood. I heard Where's Your Head At by Basement Jaxx. I think there were like 8 tracks on here that sampled Sean Paul's rapping to some extent. Oh yeah, and there was the elephant in the room. The track Sinisterrrrrrrr has a blatant sample of Wonderwall by Oasis, assumingly where the title of this project comes from. Because maybe. The production is kinda not good. Like, every single sonic element in the mix is just totally blown out and clipping. There's gratuitous auto-tune applied to lots of these samples. Not that that's really a necessarily bad production choice, but, you know. It all sounds kinda, like, tinny, there's not much bass. It's kind of a mess, but I also didn't hate the experience of listening to it. The blatant samples, I didn't actually mind them. The Oasis one was actually kind of funny. It sounded alright. The track with the Basement Jaxx sample, I think that one was Push Cycles. That was probably my favorite on here, even if I'd rather listen to the actual Basement Jaxx than this, personally. And production-wise, I can see this being excusable for the same reasons that I gave the very subpar production on The Prodigy's The Day Is My Enemy a pass. That album is still an undeniably fun listen for me and had lots of great hooks, and each song had its own memorable flavor to make up for it being so just bricked out all the way through. While not every track on here is easily recognizable and distinguishable in the same way, I mean, I only listened to it once, I feel like I at least get it. It's just something that pushes everything to the absolute extreme while never taking itself too seriously either. I can't get mad at this. Renard clearly had fun making this stuff back in the day. I can see other people having fun listening to it. I'm probably not going to come back to this again. I thought the project was pretty overstuffed at 20 tracks and didn't have even the brief breather moments that Animated Violence Mild does. By the end, the sound of the project had gotten a little stale and I was just totally tapped out. Like, I got to the penultimate track, TU4AR, and I heard all these blown out clipping noises and it just gave me a migraine. I was just sick of being constantly pummeled by all these sounds. I mean, these tracks don't all sound exactly the same, obviously, but there's not an absolute ton of variety either. But, I don't know. I guess I can still see the appeal and why this kind of stuff got the audience that it did. It's not really my thing, but if this sounds like it'd be up your alley, you want something over the top and ridiculous and noisy, feel free to give it a shot. Other people seem to really like it, so what do I know? Personally, this is a solid 6 out of 10. Next up, we got Tycho, Weather. I did review Tycho's previous album, Epoch. If you want slightly more detailed thoughts, you can check that video out, but TLDR, they're a pretty alright down-tempo outfit that started off as a Boards of Canada ripoff, but grew into their own sound fairly quickly. Their best project is probably their 2014 album, Awake. The use of guitars and the like did create a really nice listening experience in the same mix of chill down-tempo and maybe a tiny hint of post-rock, I guess. It was a pretty solid project. However, these guys are not a very interesting band to discuss. To me, they've always just been pleasant background music and never really went the extra mile past that. I enjoy putting them on every now and then, but I've never had much of anything to actually say about them. I guess this album is interesting for including vocals from Hannah Cottrell, aka Saint Sinner, on basically every track. That is not something that their other projects have. It's also notable for barely being an album at all. It's not even half an hour long and it only has 8 tracks, but whatever. So this project, it's okay. I'm not huge on Saint Sinner's vocals. They're certainly not bad, but she sounds like identical to every female guest vocalist you've ever heard on a Bonobo record. She doesn't really have much of a personality of her own, fitting that this project is their first one released on Ninja Tune. And the instrumentals, they're light and breezy, they're exactly what you would expect out of Tycho. No surprises here. Well, okay, the track Into the Woods did especially stick out to me as having some really uplifting energy and atmosphere. That track is great. The rest, it's alright. No Stress and the title track are pretty good too, I guess. I think more than anything, this project just kinda sounds cliched. Well, I feel like I've heard no shortage of material that sounds kind of like this. It kind of just made me want to go back to Bonobo's Migration instead. I don't exactly look to Tycho to put out, like, game-changing experimental material or anything, but the addition of the vocals unfortunately ended up watering down their sound even further, and making the mix even more bland. It's not terrible, it's just as pleasant as all their other projects, but it is pretty boring to me, and I can't say it's really worth going out of your way for. 5.7 out of 10. Next up, we got Holly Herndon with Proto. Right, Holly Herndon, experimental electronic artist that's caught my interest for quite a long time now, though I only just now got around to actually listening to. I did check out her previous 2 albums that are up on Spotify, Movement from 2012 and Platform from 2015. Movement was cool. It sounded like a more experimental and abstract precursor to the kinds of sounds Sophie would go on to explore. And I know Sophie is already pretty experimental. That album was pretty out there. I mean, there's a track of glitched out breathing noises. There was one solid IDM tech house-ish track, Fade, and a fun acid house freak out in the title track. It wasn't completely unapproachable. And the production was excellent all the way through, but I don't think it was consistently musical enough for me to want to hang on to. Just so much awkward empty space. I did like Platform a lot more though. That album had more accessibility with its various vocal manipulations that adhered a lot more to actual melodies. The mixes themselves had more varied texture and nuance. There were a couple of Anne Meredith-esque art pop cuts like Morning Sun. Not to say any of it was straight pop music by any stretch. It was still basically a few steps away from being a Matmos album. Especially that one weird ASMR track. But it was pretty damn solid and really well produced. I liked it. So I was intrigued for this most recent album she put out. It was apparently at least in part created by an actual AI musical generator called Spawn or something that processed most of the vocals on the album. I'm not exactly sure to what extent this processing happened or what parts were contributed by the AI specifically. I have some guesses, but I'm not going to break that down. As an album removed from that context, it's just really all over the place and scattershot. A lot of tracks that kind of just mess around with effects alongside tracks that are a bit more fleshed out and better structured, and it just does not come together as a cohesive whole at all. It feels like the results of a science experiment than something with a focused artistic vision. I mean, it's pretty cool sounding. The production is just as good as her previous output has been, and there are plenty of highlights all around. Eternal is a really cool sounding experimental pop tune. Crawler is a neat ambient-ish piece with washes of vocals and maybe also synths garbled together in a really interesting and creepy and heavily detailed mix. Even if I do kind of tap out by the end with that "why am I so lost" part that feels kind of tacked on. Swim creates this really cool epic electronic subspace, and Last Gasp applies that space to a more defined tune. But there's also tracks like Frontier, which have more pitch shifting and were kind of off-putting to listen to. Alienation was kind of forgettable and unpleasant, and nearly everything else is some like weird interlude or experiment. The one interlude I did like was Extreme Love, that one with a little girl talking over it, mainly because it reminded me of that one time M83 did that with that whole Tell Me a Story thing. And this track feels like its freakier cousin, talking about like midi-chlorians instead of frogs. And I do like that first session of Live Training, Kanan, which I think is just Herndon and a bunch of other singers without any processing. It's a nice choir piece that I guess kind of reminds me of being at church or something. But the rest, I mean, like there's Fear, Uncertainty, Doubt, which is not much more than autotune freakiness. There's Bridge, where I guess the AI is struggling to form words. And that track with Jlin, Godmother. I was looking forward to that one because name recognition, but it is like just this really unnerving, almost beatbox thing, I guess. It's just really hard to listen to, really put me off. What the actual fuck was that? I don't know. I guess at the end of the day, I do think this album is a cool concept. An album half created by vocal processing artificial intelligence is not something you see every day. Would have been pretty funny if this album had a track that sounded like the Warp Records album series. But like I could say about many Matmos projects, just because you have a cool concept or an unconventional method for making your music doesn't mean the music is automatically good. It's still on Herndon to make it work into actual compelling music, and it feels like she was only working towards that like half the time on this project, if that. I do like a few choice parts of this album, but ultimately it didn't actually feel like an album at all. It just felt like a big, scattershot, incoherent experiment, and that was it. And quite frankly, it's not really an experiment that I have a strong desire to come back to and listen to again. 5.7 out of 10. Next up we got Locked Groove with Sunset Service. I saw someone mark this album as one of their favorites in the year in the comments of my best albums of 2019 and described it as like a revolution in techno and trance or something like that. decided on a whim to give it a shot. Wasn't necessarily expecting something revolutionary, and it isn't. Nothing here I haven't heard before. But it was all pretty solid and fun to listen to. Just a nice, straightforward techno release, couple of nice trance-ish melodies here and there, some fun old-school house-ish vocal samples too, some Satyricon-era Meat Beat Manifesto-style breakbeats. There's one track, Do Not Freak, that has some deep house pianos. I will say it did start a little rough with the opener Pudding and its repetitive vocal snippet from Nate Brown. It was okay. And ending Eden featured someone named Stella, which I guess is the artist's daughter? I don't know. It had a little kid voice on top that I was kind of on. But the techno grooves throughout the project remain compellingly solid and danceable. It's not an album that really gives me much to say, but it's definitely worth checking out. I liked it. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, it's Lindsey Stirling with Artemis. I'm not sure why I was interested in covering another Lindsey Stirling project. I guess I figured it'd be something I could go through quickly. For background, I'll personally always only know her as the person who, alongside Odessa, has continually hogged the top spots of the iTunes electronic charts for like the past 8 years or something. Would be funny to see the look on the face of 2013 me if I told him that right now Lindsey Stirling still has an album in that top spot and only gave the chart a break when she marked one album as dance instead of electronic. Now don't get me wrong, I think she's a great violinist, but her actual music has always been kind of boring and unmemorable for me. And the EDM production on her first 2 albums in particular was not very good. If not for the gimmick of including her violin playing on every track, the beats behind her would not have been anything notable to write home about. Her 3rd album, Brave Enough, was noticeably better sounding than her first 2, but didn't really stick with me in the long term either. I'd say check out my review of that album for more detailed thoughts, but maybe don't, since I screwed that video up and didn't realize the album was partially a tribute to one of her backing musicians that had passed away. I'm not proud of that oversight. Apologies in advance if I make a similar one for this segment. As for this newest album, at the very least it keeps up the trend that her previous album set for actually sounding good. You got a nice core blend of her violin going up against some hard-hitting, expansive, cyberpunk-ish beats, I guess, and it does sound cool and epic or something. But, I don't know, this project just kind of blends together in a big seamless blob for me. It starts out sounding cool, but it just kind of gets stale as it goes on. I get why people would be really into this project. The production is very good. It gives all these sounds the space they need to breathe, and they do feel plenty expansive, which still places it above Shatter Me and her self-titled. But just like all her other projects, it doesn't do a good job of capturing my attention and seems kind of lacking on the ideas front. I guess Till the Light Goes Out had that weird section with the choir. That was pretty good. Between Twilight was a nice quieter moment. Dark Side had a bouncier beat that did hit hard. Love Goes On and On had some modern dubstep flares that felt kind of dated. The Upside was almost a Galantis instrumental. Not sure why we needed 2 versions of that song. The whole thing kind of slides off for me by the second half. But yeah, I mean, the melodies she plays don't have enough of a hook to stick with me in the long term. It's kind of telling that Patricia Taxon basically made like a one-off Lindsey Stirling style track on her Pix and Bit album called Castle Sinclair Gear and Go that's more memorable and replayable than anything I've ever heard from Stirling herself. I mean, if you've loved her previous work, you'll probably dig this as well. But if you're like me and didn't feel strongly either way about her stuff, it's exactly what you would expect. The production is good enough for this to just barely get a pass from me. I can't get mad at this or anything, but at the end of the day, it's just another Lindsey Stirling album, and I'm not going to remember a single lick or sound on this thing beyond whatever arbitrary clip I will have decided to use for this video. After actually listening to it on my own time, I get Shay's Trampoline stuck in my head instead. But yeah, I mean, I guess this project is fine. I guess it can get away with a solid 6. Next up we got Sam Gellaitry with Viewfinder Volume 1 Phosphine. This album I discovered through a recommendation from fellow reviewer Buffalo Staple. He properly reviewed this one several months ago in like the middle of 2019, and I only just now got around to checking it out. There are 2 more projects that I discovered from his massive, nearly 3-hour album roundup he put out a while ago that I'll be discussing right after this one. But I digress. Check out that guy's channel. Anyway, Sam Gellaitry. I guess this is his first full-length debut. It's marked as a compilation on Discogs. He's put out a series of 3 EPs all called Escapism before this that I didn't listen to. I just skipped right to this, but whatever. But I really like this. This is a set like some trap and future-based soundscapes with some sound design that is seriously just on another level. So much color and texture in every single one of these tracks, ranging from orchestral strings and jazz elements and tons of different synth patterns. It's somewhere between Flying Lotus, Fortet, and Haywire. Absolutely beautiful stuff. Not to say I don't have my issues. As consistently great as the sound design is, I wouldn't really say all of these tracks have a particularly well-defined identity. The whole thing did kind of blend together for me, a lot of it fell in the background. It hit a bit of a lull from Phosphorus to Fall that didn't really stick out to me as much. I guess Pressures did have some kind of vaporwave E flares in the beginning that I liked, but that was about it. I also wasn't big on the vocals on Explanation, even if the instrumental was pretty badass. And the album as a whole, I guess it did feel a bit padded out, a bit longer than it needed to be. But otherwise, I was pretty damn impressed with this. The various sections of Neptune, from its deep house pianos in its intro to its dreamy hip-hop and cascading synths to the middle to its Flylo-esque ending. The many sidetracks and evolutions over the 5.5 minutes of Embark that I can't really even begin to describe in a short segment like this. And the closer, Resolution. That was an absolutely climactic and beautiful way to close. The way this psychedelic soul instrumental so seamlessly transitions into those orchestras, it's so freaking nice. This is the kind of project I imagine would grow on me even more if I really let it sit with me more. I only listened to this thing twice. But it is definitely one of my favorite projects that I'll be highlighting in this video. May have a few iffy spots and tracks I could have cut, but the standouts here so absolutely floored me that they well made up for those weaker moments. Definitely check it out. I may even hang on to this one. 7.7 out of 10. Next up, we got Chance with All Together Now. The buzz I heard from this project said that people who like the Avalanches should give this a shot. So I did. I was a little worried when I found out that it was released on the Business Casual label. They've put out a fair few future funk releases that I really didn't care for and felt pretty openly lazy on a production level, so I was wary but hopeful. Once I heard the project, I heard the first track, and it sounded almost exactly like A Different Feeling. Like, I think it's even the same chord from the opening 10 seconds of that track. So yes, the Avalanches comparison is 100% warranted, almost unexpectedly so. Like, I was expecting this EP to be in the same general sonic ballpark as the Avalanches. I wasn't expecting an almost straight wholesale ripoff of Since I Left You. Exact same style of sample-based grooves and even some of the crowd noises you could hear in the background of that project. Maybe marginally more Japanese with its sample choices in the few parts. The songs even link into each other like Since I Left You, although they kind of more hard cut into each other and don't smoothly segue like the actual album does. Also, there's much less substance or variety or thought put into any of it. Every track is trying to be like Close to You, A Different Feeling, or Live at Domino's, one of those three specifically. It's all hype, no weird moments like Frontier Psychiatrist, no chill moments like Extra Kings, and it's also only 23 minutes, so there's a lot less room to accomplish a big sweeping experience. And maybe it's not fair to directly compare this no-name artist to such a legendary project, but that's the thing, Chance is not an artist who really has an identity of their own. They are basically just riding on the Avalanches' coattails and offer nothing you couldn't already get out of them. It's just the Avalanches, but with worse production and less interesting song ideas. So basically, that means I thought this EP was pretty good. I mean, if you're gonna rip off something wholesale, you may as well rip off one of my top 3 favorite albums of all time, and Chance brings the same infectious, sunshine-happy energy and fantastic retro-textured grooves. There are moments like Golden Supernatural Symphony that did have that same heightened drama and intensity to me that some of those best tracks from Since I Left You did. That track in particular was excellent, and I kept coming back to it in between writing several different segments for this video. So yeah, I think I was still pretty satisfied all the same. This project didn't convince me that Chance is like an artist I'm really sleeping on and need to pay more attention to. I think they need to bring something more unique to the table before I get more excited. But hey, if you're as big an Avalanches stan as I am, you'll probably still dig this, and forgive the obvious derivativeness. They at least got the core appeal of the Avalanches pretty well nailed down, and you could have fooled me into thinking Chance was the genuine article. So I can still co-sign this. It's good. I might hang on to this too. 7.5 out of 10. Next up we got Bjarki with Happy Earth Day. I haven't heard any of this guy's other projects aside from this one. I guess this is his 4th album out of 5. He came out with another one called Psychotic Window after this that I have not heard either. But I heard this project compared to Ski Mask and Boards of Canada. That was an intriguing mix of names to reference, so I wanted to try this out. And astonishingly, yeah, that comparison is accurate. Similar use of breakbeats and percussion patterns to that of Ski Mask, but the synth patterns on top have kind of like a spookier, more nostalgic and out-of-date feel to them that I'd more associate with BOC. Even has some deep voice radio announcers a la Tomorrow's Harvest. The whole thing immerses itself in this low-key, moody, mildly unnerving vibe, but brings in a few beats that happen to really bang and hit hard. I was pretty impressed with this album's earliest moments, like its first 2 tracks illustrating the concept between this guy's most low-key and hardest-hitting sides. One moment you got a forgotten B-side from GeoGaddy, and the next you got this super hard-hitting 80s-ish beat. Actually kind of like an Log X. And the 3rd track ups the stakes even more. It has some interesting progressions and like 2 halves, sort of. I will say going from there that there are quite a few tracks that feel like they went on a bit too long for their own good and got kind of repetitive. And I don't think any track on here ended up topping that 3rd one, but I will say this is one of the more promising projects to come out of this video. Had enough variety to keep me interested, and a unique enough blend to give BRK his own identity. I like this. Check it out. Overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10. Next up is Gaia with Moons at Jupiter. This project is apparently a side project for Armin van Buuren alongside this other guy that I don't feel like pronouncing. Now, I think I've made it clear that I'm not a fan of Armin. I think he's an immensely boring producer, and I didn't feel like giving him more than 5 seconds on-camera discussion for his last solo album. But I heard this was something a bit more experimental and out there, at least by his standards, and I was morbidly curious. Turns out this is easily the best project I've heard with Armin's name attached to it. I mean, if you go into this expecting some kind of like forward-thinking, weird experimental IDM release or something, you're gonna be disappointed. And I don't know why you would expect forward-thinking out of anything Armin's touched. But this is surprisingly solid, and not commercial much at all. Just a straightforward trance album that starts out pretty low-key and kind of ambient-centric and slowly builds up and intensifies as it goes on. Mixing a whopping 21 tracks together without any groove becoming stale or the whole mix ever losing my interest. And yeah, mix. Spotify included the whole thing as like a continuous mix, which is definitely appreciated. It's entirely instrumental too, save for a couple of tracks that repeat mildly annoying on-the-nose catchphrases like sine, square, noise, and computer, electronic, and Europa, Yeah, those moments were kind of silly, but now I kind of had the same reaction to this that I did listening to David Guetta's Jack Back mixtape. Just kind of pure shock that Armin had a project like this in him the whole time. Really helps put into perspective how half-assed Embrace and Balance were. I may not have hated either of those, but they're such obvious cash grabs it's not even funny. Balance especially. And that's even more frustrating than discovering a good Guetta project because I've always viewed Armin as a perfectly competent producer, if a laughably uncreative one. I mean, for all I know, the other member of Gaia is carrying all the weight and coming up with all the ideas, but still, I gotta give credit where credit is due. Probably benefited quite a fair bit from low expectations, but this project was actually really fun to listen to. You just want some well-produced, no-nonsense techno and trance with even a few acid flares here and there? You'll get some here. This is actually really good. 7.7 out of 10. Next up, we got Caravan Palace with Chronologic. Another album I kinda had a sort of morbid curiosity for. Thing is, a lot of people mark this band's style known as electro swing as like the worst thing ever to happen to electronic music, or even music in general, and completely irredeemable on every level. Which I always thought was weird because the name of the genre at least looked interesting and like it had the potential to work on paper. But I sampled through a bunch of old tracks from these guys at one point during the year, and well, I'm not convinced that this genre doesn't still have potential on paper. Something about their execution in particular was bizarrely self-defeating in a way that was hard to articulate. Taking from like the corniest elements from electro and swing that didn't complement each other at all. Like, canceled each other out and became mush, and could only bring up imagery of commercials that feature old people dancing or something. It was like all worse versions of Do Your Thing by Basement Jaxx. And I mean, at least you'd be repeatedly cribbing from a great track, but nothing I heard from Caravan Palace came anywhere close to being that good. But I thought, hey, maybe if I listened to a whole album instead of just tiny little snippets, my opinion might change. And, well, no, this album is bad. It's really bad. Not the worst thing I've ever heard or anything, but everything on here sounds like pre-packaged to be used in commercials and didn't provide any emotional resonance or possible imagery beyond that. Moonshine and Water Guns have like jangly guitars that sound like they're trying to sell you McDonald's. Melancholia sounds like Halsey's Without Me in a few spots. I thought I heard a reggaeton beat underneath Plume. There's Kygo snaps on like every song and a few weird rubbery drops that just pull the rug out underneath any track they appear on. Especially see the track April. That track could have been decent if not for that drop. And all the swing elements feel tacked on and don't really work into any of these tracks, forming any kind of coherent groove. The samples are all fine out of context, but the way they're implemented into this hyper-commercial mix gets more and more off-putting with each passing track. Not one musical element in any given mix meshes well with anything else, and it went from mildly pleasant to mildly repulsive. If you want the best demonstration of how nothing in this album fits together, look at the second track, About You. The obnoxious female half-rapping, the Tecton guest singer, the stock percussion which I think I have access to in FL Studio, the honking swing sample which feels totally out of place, and the cherry on top is this ridiculous blown-out bass line that sounds pulled out of Calvin Harris's Slow Acid and sounds like off-sync with the sample underneath. Nothing about it really works at all, and only makes sense coming out of like some kind of advertising agency's focus group. I can't even say that the ideas explored here are super unique and you can't get anything else like them elsewhere. Grammatic's Beats and Pieces Volume 1 in his whole Street Banger series utilizes very similar samples, but keeps the mix very much simpler and stripped back. Nothing clashes in those mixes like these do. I mean, granted, there's a very apparent formula in his stuff that gets stale if you listen to too many of his albums, but it's not a formula that doesn't work at its core. Also check out the Noisy Freak Straight Life. It kind of like French house and disco sort of album that has a lot of musical elements in common with this, but lets its house and disco take more of the focus, with its jazzier elements actively complementing the grooves. I wouldn't exactly call that album a masterpiece itself, but it's far better executed than this. I mean, if you already enjoy this album and Caravan Palace's other music, good on you. This project doesn't make me angry or anything, and I guess I can see some people digging it. No pun intended. But something about this project is triggering some kind of, like, uncanny value reaction in me that's hard to put into words, and I can't honestly recommend it to anyone based on my own experience. I don't like it. I'm overall feeling a 3.5 out of 10. Next up, it's Oval with Skis, or however you say that. Hey, it's a project actually from 2020. I've talked about Oval before. I reviewed his last studio album, Pop, a while back. If you want to hear more detailed thoughts on his work, you can go check that video out. But long story short, he's a fairly prolific experimental artist who helped pioneer glitch music. He has one longtime favorite classic in 94 Discount, a project made mostly out of the sounds of skipping CDs that's somehow quite relaxing and immersive, and a lot of his stuff since hasn't been my thing much, but he constantly pushes himself into new territory. More relevant to this album was that last album, Pop, which, despite being nothing like 94 Discount, I saw as one of his most fun and enjoyable and refreshing releases to date. A hyper-dense album of club bangers with a twist that packed so many sounds into its mix to the point of sensory overload, but in a good way. There were still plenty of enjoyable and almost poppy but heavily fractured and glitchy and arrhythmic melodic elements the whole way through. It was pretty damn impressive, and this latest album looked to be more of that kind of stuff. And yeah, basically just copy-paste all my thoughts on that album over to this one. I mean, it's basically the exact same album again, if maybe a tiny bit tighter, but not by much. And given how I really liked Pop, I'm not complaining. Better than 2 hours of squeaky solo guitar pieces. I suppose one difference is that I thought Pop started a lot stronger. This album's opener kind of starts me off on the wrong foot. Tweerer starts out intriguing with its playful pianos and kotos and glitchy synth licks, but then brings in this one hyper-abrasive, distorted synth line that just crashes through everything and feels totally out of place and even off-key. I suppose this makes this track more disorienting, and much of Oval's discography is disorienting by design, but it felt like he built up something compelling and then just ruined it. The rest of the album, though, does at least fare much better than that. Blending all those crashing percussion textures and intense in-your-face synth leads with all the various more subtle melodic textures all around it in a way that blends better. On a track like Mick, for instance, these big percussive synths sound like they're really building up some, like, tribal beat with some real tension behind it. It works really well, and I do tend to gravitate more towards the tracks here that focus more on those more subtle and quieter textures like Rob UC and Improg. There's so much detail and texture, and it sounds absolutely incredible without feeling overwhelming. There's a moment during the track Push where the beat just gives way to all these cascades of vibraphones that had a similar texture to those on the ever-classic Oval track Do While, which very much put a smile on my face. Both this and Pop have been albums that needed a specific time and place for me to get into the most. You could even tell me they sound like a complete incoherent mess, and I would mostly agree with you, even if it's very much a carefully sculpted mess that's really well produced. Nothing in the mix, as random as it may be on the surface, feels unintentional or haphazard, kinda like a later period Outakar album, but with more color and personality and sweetness. Like if you covered all these experimental textures in bright club pop and IDM sugar to help them go down easier. It is a pretty straightforward rehash of something he already did, and I don't know how much it's gonna stick with me, but I don't know. I still had fun with it at the end of the day. I don't mind Oval continuing in this direction. I'm overall feeling a solid 7 out of 10 on this. Next up, we got SebastiAn with Thirst. Pretty commonly requested project this one was. Didn't really catch my interest by itself, but a lot of people asked me about it. I guess since he's on Ed Banger Records, he's pretty closely associated with people like Justice and Mr. Wazo and all those. So I gave him a shot. I made sure to listen to his debut album, Total, first, and yeah, that definitely sounded like Justice and Mr. Wazo. It's a giant collection of abrasive, blown-out French electro house that absolutely hits hard in all the same ways as Cross. It is really damn long. 51 minutes may not seem like much, but much like Animated Violence Mild, I very much felt that length through its unrelentingly over-the-top, bricked-out production that never gives you a moment to breathe. And its overabundance of tracks. Maybe could have edited it down from 22. But hey, if you love Justice, you'll probably love Total as well. And I still thought it was pretty good myself. That said, this segment concerns his follow-up, Thirst. Despite the more violent album cover, Thirst seems to actually know how to exercise restraint. In general, seems to be more low-key and more slow-paced than Total. I mean, it's still quite loud and blaring in many moments, and sounds kinda like something Justice would do. It doesn't sound like a completely different artist or anything, but if you want an album with just unrelenting bangers in the same way as Total, you'll be disappointed. Instead, you get an album of mostly, like, dramatic slow burn cuts. I personally quite welcome the change of pace. I don't think I actually enjoyed the album more than Total, but it was marginally easier to get through. I really like moments on here like Better Now, which has this kind of like Baroque pop slant and aimed to sound kind of like God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. Or Doorman, which had this really smooth vocal guest appearance from Sid, and these beautiful piano progressions going up against its more abrasive electronic textures. Sev sounded awesome with its orchestral touches that really made it sound more epic, as did Beograd, though that one was even more of an actual banger with more meat on its bones and two halves, kind of. I think that one is probably the best track on here. Devyoka was like a darker ambient orchestral piece or something, appreciated that inclusion. Time to Talk sounded kind of like one of those lower key moments from Justice's Woman, like Stop. That one was really good, developed some solid groove too. And Handcuffed to a Parking Meter got its Giorgio on with the beat, and had a fun and catchy guest vocal appearance from Sparks. But there's also tracks on here like the title track and Movement that I just don't really care about one way or the other, or Sweet, or Sober, or Run For Me, which I didn't really like the vocal appearances on. I mean, on the whole, the album's cool. There's nothing here I absolutely love, but there's nothing I hated either. I at least liked most of the tracks on here, and it did get markedly better in its later moments. It definitely has its standouts. I mean, I'm probably not going to remember this exists in the long term or keep it around, but if you really like Justice's Woman, if you could get into that album's lower key moments, you'll probably have fun with this. Does not have a Safe and Sound or a chorus equivalent, unfortunately, but whatever. I thought it was fine. Like a 6.7 out of 10, I guess. Next up, we got Apache with Requiem EP.
Please, dress me, Your Majesty.
Another project not from 2019, but I had to listen to this one when going through Landon Remixes' choice for our Essential Electronic Albums of the 2010s video. Go check that video out. Now, I hadn't yet heard every project he highlighted there when we first started work on the video, but of the projects he highlighted that I hadn't heard, there were some I really liked and wanted to keep around, like Haywire's Twofold and Sakura Burst's Deconstructing Nature. There were some I wasn't really feeling, like Millennium's Ashes and Corella's Get Wet. Though the only project he highlighted that I outright disliked was the obvious Flume one. The Apache EP, though, I'm highlighting specifically because I have some very different things to say about it than Landon did in his segment, and not necessarily positive things. I mean, don't worry, I didn't hate it. I thought it was alright, though I needed to listen to it a couple of times to warm up to it. On first listen, I thought this EP was a borderline joke and couldn't comprehend what the actual fuck I was listening to. In case you didn't know, this is a 3-track remix project / tribute to Mozart's Requiem in D minor, the last compositions he made before he died. Apache, though, is an artist that operates snugly within the No. Apache, though, is an artist that operates snugly within the trap genre. So this EP is basically 3 straightforward trap remixes of the Mozart pieces, following all the cliches of the genre. The rattling hi-hats and percussion patterns, the blaring horn and gun-cocking sounds, etc., even to rapper guest features. When one of the first things I hear in this EP is rapper Wasiu making a Lil Wayne style I'm the shit joke, I was very worried about what I'd just gotten myself into. And the second track, featuring another rap verse from Black Prez going on and on about how he's a beast, I was like, geez, they stopped saying beast when I was in high school. How do you think this is still cool? And then Lacrimosa's sampling of dialogue from the movie Amadeus with F. Murray Abraham as Salieri saying, "Oh, I didn't write that, that was Mozart." And I was like, wow, no shit. First listen to this, I couldn't take a single second of this CP seriously to any capacity and was somewhere between cracking up and being horrified. It gave me some serious, like, Stars on 45 vibes. For those who don't know what that is, basically at one point my mom found like this weird record of like a medley of disco versions of Beatles songs and played it for us. And we all agree that it was absolutely terrible, combining these two things that had no business being together in the most cynical cash grab way, and had me realize, oh, so this is why everyone wanted disco dead back then. That said, the initial cringe factor on this EP did wear off a fair bit on second listen. Because, if nothing else, this EP was definitely not a half-assed cynical cash grab in the same way. Everyone involved in this EP is 100% convinced that this is just the coolest shit you've ever heard, and are doing it purely and sincerely out of love for the music. They're giving it their all. Apache himself, I heard, even recorded the orchestral and choir performances himself for the sake of giving this EP better defined texture. Not to mention, trap and Mozart don't clash as heavily as disco and the Beatles. I have heard big bombastic trap instrumentals that try to have like an orchestral quality to them before, so it's not like there's no precedent for something like this, or I can't see why someone might find this idea to be so cool in the first place. It works better than it probably has any right to. I'm probably not going to hang on to it or listen to it again, but I can see why Landon and other people really dug it. It is an absolutely insane experience, to say the very least. Not my thing, but I get the appeal. I guess 6.5 out of 10. Next up is Niels Fromm with All Encores. Niels Fromm's All Melody was one of my most listened to projects of 2018, And while there's no new insight I can get out of it anymore and much of its impact has been muted from personal overplay, I wanted to give this collection of B-sides from that album, compiling 3 EPs all called Encores, a shot, in hopes of leaving a stronger impact due to my not having heard it 20 times and wearing it into the ground. And okay, no, it's not better than the album proper, of course, but it was nice. A lot more of the tracks on this project are just solo piano for the most part. More stuff like My Friend the Forest and Forever Changeless, where you can hear the subtle creaking and shuffling of the piano keys themselves. I like that. There is a fairly long-winded solo harmonium track called Harmonium the Well, which was okay. And this whole project, it does definitely pick up more in its second half. Once we get to the track A Walking Embrace, we really start to get into the more textured and evocative stuff I was hoping to get more of. Can still be minimalistic, but it does have an undeniable soothing quality to everything. And Talisman has all these whooshing ambient pads that are great, and Spells is kind of a more rollicking synth groove track a la number 2 from the original All Melody. Can get a bit repetitive and long-winded, but it was also pretty nice. And the album also ends with 2 really long pieces. All Armed is probably better than either the title track or number 2 from All Melody. Also kind of somewhere in that ballpark, but the use of the marimbas and the subtle drum beats and other clanging percussion around it just keeps some tension going. That's a fantastic track. Easily the best one on this little collection. And A Mirador, it's not quite as great, just as a pure ambient piece with the last 2 minutes or so just a quiet pad of white noise slowly fading out. But before that, it's cool too. I mean, overall, All Encores is probably not an essential listen. It's obviously a B-sides collection and doesn't have the same cohesiveness or thought put into it that the main album does. There's quite a few cuts here that aren't very interesting, but there are definitely a couple of excellent standouts from here that I'm going to be hanging on to. And I think the whole thing's at least worth a shot if you were as into All Melody as I was. I think this 6.5 out of 10. And finally, we're finishing with Alon Mor, Lands of Delight. Alright, last segment. It may be weird in and of itself that an artist like Alon Mor is appearing on a video like this at all. Some people may recall that I very positively reviewed his 2017 album Long Awaited Journey and found it to be one of the most dense and rewarding albums I've run into this decade. It very much one that needed lots of repeat listens to wrap my head around any capacity. And it is worth noting that while I did not have enough to say about this follow-up to give it a video on its own, I do also think it's a great project. Virtually none of the biggest issues I had with Long Awaited Journey that prevented that album from crossing over into 9 out of 10 territory show up on Lands of Delight. There's no spoken word elements, there's none of those weird abstract tracks that are mostly like cracking ice sound effects and didn't let any of the brief seconds of compelling musical ideas any chance to develop. He definitely let them develop and gave them space to breathe this time around. The production again is absolutely stellar and maybe even better than A Long Awaited Journey somehow, combining elements of abstract IDM-ish styles with orchestral elements and occasionally quick moments of metal music in the later points on this album. The kind of blend that I can only associate with his music and that only he could deliver on the level that he does. But I did not enjoy this more than Long Awaited Journey. For one thing, this album is really short. Only 7 tracks and not even 40 minutes long total. It doesn't have the feeling of density or being a big event to the same extent that Long Awaited Journey did. Another thing that's worth noting is that I could tell the individual tracks on that album apart from each other a lot more easily than this one. Most of this album is kind of structureless. These tracks just kind of flow from one idea to the next, and more feel like they blend together as a singular piece instead of having much identity of their own. And there aren't really melodic motifs here that I can associate with any track in particular. This is an album concerned with sound design first and foremost. But, you know, an album doesn't necessarily need tracks with well-defined structures or catchy tunes to be great, and I can still absolutely give this album my full-on recommendation. Long Awaited Journey may be better to me, and for whatever reason, after like 3 or 4 listens of this thing, I didn't feel a strong urge to come back to it again. Didn't connect with me as strongly from an emotional level as his last one, hence why it didn't appear on the 2019 year-end list or the Essential Albums of the Decade list, despite Landon being much more enthusiastic about it than I was. But this is still pretty great, and delivers everything you'd want out of an Alon Mor project. And it's a good example of how I believe that lack of specific things for me to discuss doesn't necessarily translate to the album being worse. I think if you only listen to one project highlighted in this video, may as well make it this one. overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. And that's finally the end of all these freaking mini reviews. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.